derem o like, se inscreverem e derem o like, é acobertado por Deus e o Divino Espírito Santo. E se não derem o like, está acompanhado com todos os cães que tiver no inferno: Caim, Satanás, Pão Grosso e Parafuso, Botafogo, Lúcifer, que é o chefe de lá, e meu avô, que é o comandante de tudo. Botar para arrombar em vocês, tudo aí.
Looking almost similar to the sprites from The Flash, another Master System game, this Bat game doesn't exactly capture the movie's aesthetic, but that's okay in my book. Everything is well detailed and you can tell what's what, you can even tell where you can and can't use the grappling hook, places you can grapple are much thinner than the standard floor tiles. In the final stage of the game, there is a waterfall section that is pretty eye-straining, maybe even seizure-inducing. I wouldn't play this game if you are epileptic. While it's certainly no Sunsoft NES Batman, most of the music is pretty catchy. Does it fit Batman? Not particularly, but I'm happy with it regardless. Would have liked to have had an FM version, but despite this game being developed in Japan, it was unfortunately only released in Europe. Every stage has its own unique song, even Catwoman and Penguin get their own boss themes, that to me tells me that they really did want to put a lot of effort into the game's soundtrack. Some will automatically compare this to Bionic Commando on the NES, but with a few differences. The most obvious being that Batman can do the one thing Rad Spencer can't: jump. The grappling hook is mostly used for platforms that Batman can't jump to on his own. The grapple is pretty responsive. The grappling hook is so good that it even breaks those bat things containing items and damages enemies, making the Catwoman fight rather easy. These items can give you an extra life, increase the range of your batarang, or increase the length of your grapple if I'm correct. Similar to Contra, your lives meter is your health bar. One hit and you're dead, and thankfully you can respawn immediately where you died or at a safe distance from where you died, plus there's plenty of extra lives scattered throughout the levels. There are some parts where enemies come up out of nowhere and are hard to avoid, but generally it's not really unfair, so to speak. The only issue I have with these controls is that you cannot switch direction when jumping. This makes needing to grapple onto things quickly pretty unnecessarily difficult, but this probably was an oversight by the developers. Even in the fourth level where there's water falling from the weird mouth statues, you don't actually lose a life when you get hit by them, you just get knocked back. This is an incredibly good handicap to new players because a lot of the time you would have expected them to just kill you instantly like in a lot of these retro platformers. The bosses have pretty easy to follow attack patterns, especially the third stage boss. Catwoman's attack patterns genuinely look like they belong in a Mega Man fight, which I think is pretty interesting to see. Though, her first fight is pretty easy due to the grappling hook's reach. The second fight with her has her jumping up a lot higher and dropping down what I assume are knives. The Penguin is understandably the hardest boss in the game, and he's one of the rare examples of a boss in a Master System game with more than one phase. He goes from simply flying around and dropping bombs, to floating in mid-air and shooting umbrellas, to driving some kind of duck-like attack vehicle. I unfortunately have not seen any of Batman Returns, but I assume that because of how Catwoman and Penguin are present, with Penguin being the final boss, that the story loosely follows the movie. If you like platformers, this might be something you'd like. It's not as iconic as Bionic Commando on the NES, or the most iconic Batman game, but it's mixture of both. While there are a few spots that aren't really done well, the game is still worth playing. It is so unfortunate that this wasn't released in the US, due to the Master System being discontinued before this game came out. The Game Gear version did release worldwide, but the larger screen makes it much more enjoyable. I initially started out describing how similar it was to Bionic Commando, but really the only similarities it has are the grappling hook mechanic and the one-hit deaths. Batman games were sort of an anomaly back in the day in that they were titles that proved licensed and superhero games could actually be good. This was largely thanks to the fact that so many of them were handled by Konami, who were one of the powerhouse developers of their time before succumbing to darker times. Konami actually handled quite a few licensed characters from Batman to TMNT, and the results in the 90s were at the very least respectable and filled with passion. It wasn't just their own IPs they cared about back then, but any game they were handling. I miss those days. It sort of makes sense for a game based on Batman Returns to make its way on the SNES, given that the original movie had an adaptation on the NES. A sequel to the movie equals a sequel to the game on the sequel to the original hardware. We're reaching Inception levels of sequels here. The game is mostly styled in the format of a traditional beat-em-up where you move across the stage as Batman and bash in the skulls of clowns, quite literally, as you can grab two members of the clown gang and smash their craniums together. They may say Batman never kills, but he has certainly been crippling people for decades. Not that I'm complaining, because clowns are creepy regardless of gang status. It is in these beat-em-up levels that Konami's passion and quality really shines through, putting their best foot forth. In addition to fun gameplay, they aimed to really capture the tone and mood of the movie the game is based on, and they certainly succeeded in that. That dark, heavy feeling of the Tim Burton movie is represented perfectly here. The streets of Gotham City are dark, gothic, and dreary even against the backdrop of Christmas decorations. The music has a very heavy tone to it. The members of the clown gang look absolutely disturbing and psychopathic, not that it takes much effort for clowns to look evil, mind you. The action itself matches that heavy feeling with a strong sense of impact behind Batman's punches and kicks. The strong crunch that resounds every time you kick a clown in the face is felt every single time, as is the feeling of hoisting one up and slamming them onto the cold, unforgiving concrete below. The gameplay is straightforward. You punch, kick, and throw enemies. Batman is also armed with a batarang that will briefly stun enemies in these areas, as well as a couple test tubes that serve as all-screen attacks. It is Batman, after all, so we expect him to fight with gadgets and tools as well as his fists and feet. It is traditional beat-em-up action that does not stray far from the basics, but it is in the execution that it works. On a technical level it is tight, polished, and responsiveness. On a feedback level it both looks and feels great. While there is not much in the way of variety, you can grab two enemies as previously mentioned and slam them together. A bit tricky to pull off and usually more for show, but man is it cool to see. When there's certain objects in the background like windows or benches, you can also casually fling enemies into them and break the scenery apart to boot. Nonchalantly throwing a psychopath dressed as a clown into a window and watching it shatter, or a bus stop sign. Yeah, this is a Batman game, alright. The overall design and feel is great, with the deliciously dark visuals really providing that immersion of being the caped crusader. It is incredibly basic and repetitive, but ever so satisfying. Just walk around, beat the crap out of criminals, it's awesome. To get around that feeling of repetition, Batman Returns decides to mix up its stages with a little bit of variety. It is here that, unfortunately, the game falls apart. The main secondary level design is that of a pure 2D side-scrolling action game, where you cannot move up or down on the field but only jump. Here, Your Batarang goes from being a stun weapon to your primary attack as you fling an unlimited amount of them at everything that crosses your path. On top of that, we now get to wield Batman's famous grappling belt in certain situations. Great idea in concept, but not in delivery. The first flaw is that the character models are too big. Batman's large, detailed design is perfectly fine in the more open beat-em-up areas, but in other sections he is taking up too much real estate. When you walk right, you will find yourself walking into enemies and hazards that smack you before you even register the fact that danger has popped up. Fat clowns are a big offender, randomly bouncing into the screen so suddenly you can't throw enough weapons to kill them before taking a hit. The tall clowns are another annoyance. These giant enemies lob torches at you and can only be taken out by jumping up and hitting their head, but the range of their attacks as well as their precise weak spot forces you to stay towards the edge of the screen, where enemies love to approach from the other side and hit you from off-screen. You can get to the edge of the screen, jump up to attack, and take a cheap shot from an enemy that appears from behind. All because Batman is too bulky. These sections lead to quite a few spots that feel more frustratingly cheap than genuinely challenging. As for the grappling hook, it also suffers from a problem that can be followed back to how real estate everything takes. When trying to time your grappling hook to carry yourself across a hazardous spot, you can easily launch yourself right into a hazard and take damage before you know it. Even after multiple times I can find myself scrolling right into damage. This tends to result in constantly mashing the button so that you just inch back and forth like an indecisive idiot trying to time your approach. What's annoying is that outside of these moments where you aren't caught up in cheap level design, these spots are actually kind of fun. We are playing as Batman, after all, so it feels great to smack people in the face with batarangs before using our grapple belt to hover over a burning building. This game really does pull out on the stops to make you feel like you are Batman, and in terms of presentation it absolutely nails it. The dark atmosphere, the brutal sound effects, the inclusion of Batman's more iconic gadgets. This is a Batman game, it looks like one, sounds like one, and plays like one without a doubt. Sadly, those cheap moments are not exactly infrequent. They are not just limited to these side-scrolling action platformer bits either, but also some boss fights like Catwoman. I got frustrated once to the point of watching walkthroughs of this game just to see a good method to beat her, and saw a lot of people either just grind or find a way to cheese the fight. She is definitely beatable, but her second fight is annoying as hell and not in a fun way. Then there is Scarecrow, whose attack pattern not only results in the occasional unavoidable hit but can also glitch out and stop taking damage from your regular attacks. This happened to me on more than one occasion. I will say this, though, the stage where you drive the Batmobile is just plain cool. The one deviation from the main game that I really have no gripes with. In fact, I'm disappointed that we didn't get more sections like that. Why couldn't we get at least a second driving section? Konami really went all in on making this a faithful adaptation that really makes you feel like the Caped Crusader. From beating the crap out of criminals the old-fashioned way and lobbing mechanical menaces at their heads in a totally non-lethal fashion to hovering above the city with your grappling hook and shooting down people with the Batmobile, everything feels authentic alongside that dark and gothic atmosphere. Sadly, some levels are just not designed that well and lead to more frustration than fun. Don't think that means this is a bad game, however. It is most definitely a good game, and its strong points certainly outweigh the bad parts. It is just that said bad parts are also a hindrance to the overall experience. Still, This is fun and authentic title that would be enjoyed by anyone wanting to go up down the streets of Gotham, kicking in faces while growling, "I'm Batman."